That is the story of this country. The story of generations of people who felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation, but who kept on striving and hoping and doing what needed to be done.
Hi, my name is Sebastian, and I live in a little city called Columbia in the state of Maryland. Columbia, Maryland was founded in the 1960s. It was a time when our country was largely still segregated. Black families were disproportionately trapped in the cycle of poverty and sequestered off to poor inner-city neighborhoods. It was a time when white supremacists were bombing churches. It was a time when interracial marriage was illegal. And yet, in the midst of all this racial brutality occurring in our country, years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, an urban planner and philanthropist named James Rouse decided to build a planned community right outside of Baltimore City, where families of all races could live together side by side. At first, he started secretly buying up land and getting investors to donate to his project, which was codenamed Shangri-La. He had to keep it a secret because at this time segregation had not yet been made illegal. While he was planning for this project, he sent a profound memo to his real estate agents and developers, saying that Columbia would be a truly open city. Simply stated, we are colorblind. This means that every person or family coming to Columbia to seek a lot, an apartment, a house, to start a business, to golf, tennis, ride horseback, sail, swim, or use any other facility open to the public will be treated alike regardless of whether the color of his skin is white, black, brown, or yellow. By 1967, Rouse made it possible for impoverished black families to live in the exact same neighborhoods as rich white families. He opened up opportunities for black-owned small businesses to thrive. He ensured that black children could receive the same high-quality education as their white classmates. James Rouse called this one-of-a-kind city Columbia. For its entire existence, this place has been known as a haven for interracial couples. During a time when interracial marriage was still illegal in Maryland, Columbia was a refuge and a safe place for these couples. If you come here today and you look around at the people who live here, you will see a plethora of beautiful multiracial families. I myself am a product of one of those families. But the place where Columbia stands today wasn't always a diverse utopia. Not more than 200 years ago, it used to be an inseparable part of the American South. It used to thrive not on equal opportunity, but on oppression. And there's a place right in the middle of my own neighborhood that demonstrates the cruelty that once occurred here all too perfectly. I want to take you to visit that place. And I want to tell you a terrifying yet inspiring story that began there. So let's go. So we're going to about a 200-acre patch of woodlands called Blandair Regional Park. Now, sort of right in the middle of this patch of woodlands, there's some big open fields. And right near those fields, there's some abandoned structures, barns, houses, and that's where I want to take you. Here it is, the entrance to Blandair North. Oh, good thing I didn't bring any alcoholic beverages. Before white men came to this land, it's thought that the Susquehannock tribe built temporary settlements here. Now, it's also thought that the Susquehannock had many great battles here with their adversaries, the Iroquois tribe. Over the course of its history, this land has been owned by many prestigious people, and a representative in Congress, a judge, and even a decorated Navy Commodore. He's going to be pretty important in our story later. And here we are. The fields of Blandair Regional Park North. For most of its history, these fields grew tobacco, wheat, and produce. But what interests me is not what grew in these fields, but who grew those things. For most of its modern history, these fields were worked by slaves. Here we are, the remains of Blandair Plantation. Now, the first family who owned this land, the Talbot family, actually didn't have any slaves. It was against their Quaker religion. But when they sold it to others, this place soon became a slave plantation, and by 1850, there were more than 15 slaves living here, aging from 3 months to 70 years old. Right behind me is the Blandair Manor House. It was built in 1857. At that time, the number of slaves living here almost reached 20. And those slaves lived in that house right over there. This is the Blandair Slave Quarters. It was built in 1845. This building is where nearly every slave who worked here would live. Now, I want to tell you a story about a very specific slave who lived here. Her name was Matilda Neal. Matilda presumably lived in this very house for some time. She was a slave under the ownership of Captain Isaac Mayo, a decorated Navy officer. Matilda was a house girl, so she was considered of a higher grade than the field hands, though she was still treated very harshly. Matilda describes her harsh treatment in a court affidavit taken a few years later. She says, "When my mistress was raised, she ordered me whipped. The overseer did the whipping with the cowskin, generally 25 lashes. The marks sometimes remained for weeks, sometimes brought blood. I was often threatened with being sold when my mistress was in a passion. I was badly treated and could not stand it, and had not been used to it." But there was one light of hope in Matilda's dark life. Her husband, Richard and Neal. Richard was a newly freed black man who used to work at a neighboring plantation. He married Matilda in 1839, and together they had 5 kids: William, Rachel, Mary, Emmeline, and little baby James. After Richard was freed by his former master, he bought some farmland down by the Chesapeake Bay. He decided to start working to raise enough money to buy his family so they could all live in freedom together. Richard writes of his time as a free man while his family were still slaves. He says, "I often furnished my family, who were servants of Captain Mayo, with flour, tea, coffee, and sugar, sometimes clothes and other articles. When I ate at my wife's quarters, it was out of my own provisions and not Captain Mayo's." Richard was certainly a hardworking, industrious young man. Matilda couldn't wait any longer to be free, so she took her 5 kids, including her year-old baby, and fled. Fled in a group of about 7 other slaves, totaling 13. They escaped by the river and went all the way to Baltimore City. But 3 weeks later, they were caught. Matilda writes this about her time right after she was caught. "I was sold to a trader from Tennessee of the name of Gordon with all my children. Captain Mayo told him to take us out of the state, as far as wind and water would carry us. He told him he wished him to separate us 3,000 miles apart. The captain told me my babe was to be sold from my breast. Mr. Gordon told me afterward that we were not to be sold together, but each one to a different person. It was Captain Mayo's request. My babe was about a year old, and he told me my babe was to be sold from me." Captain Mayo and Mr. Gordon ended up fulfilling their dark and twisted promise to Matilda. Each of her children was sold to a different person in a different state, all the way down to Mobile, Alabama. When Matilda escaped, Richard was actually away from home. When he heard the news that his wife had fled, he decided to go up to Philadelphia to seek help from friends. He thought that he would be blamed for inciting his wife to run away. Fortunately, a wealthy Quaker living there, named Mr. Francis King, decided to help Richard get his family back. King traveled all the way down to Mobile, Alabama, to get the last of Richard's children. Now, the Neal family was all bought using the money that Richard had been saving up for years. But 3 years later, in January of 1853, Commodore Isaac Mayo's thirst for revenge boiled over. He got a warrant, a fugitive slave warrant, from the governor of Maryland, on false testimony from one of his slaves, William Hunter. But instead of waiting for the proper law enforcement officers to come and handle the arrest, Captain Isaac Mayo took the arrest of Richard Neal into his own hands. Isaac Mayo enticed Richard into his carriage and started taking him down south to be tried in Maryland. Now keep in mind, at this time Richard was living in Pennsylvania. And the thing is that Richard was never told what the charge against him actually was, a clear violation of the rights of the accused. Richard says in his sworn affidavit, "When I was in Chester, I was locked in prison. I was handcuffed and chained to the floor. Captain Mayo stayed in the room all night to watch. The captain never told me what the true charge was against me. He did not read anything to me. He only asked me if I had anything to say. I said no." A group of Richard's friends and abolitionists started following Mayo and the kidnapped Richard down south, at a town called Chester in Pennsylvania. The group finally caught up to Mayo at a train station. There at the train station in Chester, they showed Captain Mayo the writ of habeas corpus, a legal statement saying that the accused must be allowed to come to the courthouse in Pennsylvania. So, Richard went back to Philadelphia. The trial was held in the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and fortunately, Richard was released on the very first day of the trial. Soon after Richard was acquitted, he called for Captain Isaac Mayo to be relieved from his command. But this did not happen. Soon after this, the Neal family and their story faded into history. No one really knows about them anymore. So what happened to Commodore Isaac Mayo? In 1861, when tensions were very high between the North and the South, Commodore Isaac Mayo decided that he could not support the North because of his pro-Southern rhetoric and his many, many slaves. So he asked to be allowed to resign from the Navy. But Lincoln himself sent him a letter saying that instead he was to be kicked out. And on the date that he received this letter, May 18th, 1861, Commodore Isaac Mayo was found dead in his estate from a gunshot wound. Historians presume that he committed suicide. So that is the terrifying and inspiring story of the Neal family. And as for Commodore Isaac Mayo's legacy, well, one newspaper writing at the time certainly sums it up well. In regard to Commodore Isaac Mayo of the United States Navy, no words can be strong enough to express the contempt which his conduct has excited in every liberal mind. He has stooped to acts which not only disgraces him, but the uniform he wears. He has invoked the forms of law to carry out his fraud and malice. He attempted to carry off a free man by force and violence, only appealing to the law as a shield for his own trickery. It's cold and wet and rainy out here, so I'm gonna head home. But when I get back, let's talk a little more about why the story of Richard and Matilda Neal matters. Alright, I am back and soaking wet. Now let's talk about the story of Richard and Matilda Neal. So one thing I didn't get to tell you while I was out there at Blandair Plantation is that there were never any photographs taken of the Neal family. There is, however, one little bit of information that might lead us to what Matilda Neal looked like. In her runaway ad, which appeared in the Baltimore Sun newspaper, it says that she always wears her hair twisted up behind as a white person. Now this fact about Matilda Neal's appearance has incredible significance to me, because it shows us that Matilda had a certain amount of strength and knowledge of her own self-worth to wear her hair like that every day. She had to have courage. And that leads back around to the whole purpose of the story of Richard and Matilda Neal. To me, their story is terrifying, but inspiring. It's terrifying for obvious reasons, but it's inspiring because of the persistence and strength shown by the Neal family. This one family endured whippings, being separated across the country, a kidnapping, and a criminal trial. And half of all that occurred when they were already freed from bondage. Throughout all their struggles, Matilda and Richard persevered. We all know about the strength shown by famous former slaves like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, or Sojourner Truth. But pretty much no one remembers that this same type of strength was demonstrated at this little plantation in the middle of a nature park in Columbia, Maryland. Not often do we remember how widespread the horrors of slavery actually were. So widespread that they even existed in what is now one of the most diverse and inclusive cities in America. Likewise, not often do we remember that the miraculous strength and endurance of enslaved people was not an isolated thing. It wasn't specific to Harriet Tubman or Booker T. Washington. It was an attribute of nearly every slave, from Maryland all the way down to Georgia. I think that the story of Richard and Matilda Neal demonstrates that there are so many slaves whose remarkable stories of persistence has been lost to history. And that it's worth it to learn about them, to tell their stories, and to remember our own country's dark history. Though my city's history is full of civil rights advances, equal opportunity, and diversity, I can't forget that the legacy of Blandair Plantation is also a part of the story of my town. I want to end this little video with something that James Rouse, the founder of Columbia, once said in an interview.
And as you work and study in those roles, you become aware that the racial separation is a destructive force in America, and that it can be overcome. And therefore, we need to do all of the things that can be done to facilitate that change, that transformation in the relationship of people.
We need to do all that can be done. And a part of that is making sure that the stories of these slaves like Richard and Matilda Neal are never forgotten.